the world had turned to red dust. One moment, Evelyn Hart was tracing the familiar ruts of the wagon trail, the canvas flap of the supply wagon ahead of her a steady, pale beacon. The next, the horizon vanished, swallowed by a roiling wall of ochre that tasted of grit and smelled of a fury older than memory. The wind shrieked, a physical blow that staggered her mule and tore the reins from her numb fingers. She pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, but the dust was a persistent thief, stealing her breath, stinging her eyes until they were squeezed shut against the assault. The wagon train, her job, her only tether to the known world, disappeared. There was no sound but the screaming wind and the grinding of sand against rock. Eve clung to the mule's saddle, her body a tight knot of will against the storm's effort to unmake her. She was a cook, not a scout. Her domain was the careful geography of a fire pit, the alchemy of flour and water, the comforting heft of her mother's cast-iron skillet. Out here, in the teeth of the Arizona Territory's displeasure, she was just another small thing about to be scoured from the earth. Her mule, a creature of stubborn practicality, was her savior. It turned its rump to the worst of the wind and, with its head hung low, began a slow, blind shuffle. Eve had no choice but to follow, one hand gripping the lead rope, the other pressed against the precious wooden chest strapped to the mule's back. Inside, nestled in sawdust and cloth, were her spices, the tools of her trade, her mother's worn Bible and the leather-bound book of recipes, its pages soft as doe skin and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 meals, were in there too. To lose the chest was to lose her livelihood. To lose the book was to lose her mother all over again. Hours bled into a timeless agony of leaning into the wind. When the mule finally stopped, its body trembling with exhaustion, Eve dared to open her eyes. The storm had lessened its assault, the world now a hazy twilight of settling dust. They stood at the mouth of a shallow rock alcove, a dark scar in a low mesa that offered the first real shelter she had seen since the sky broke open. She slid the chest from the mule's back, her muscles screaming in protest. It was heavy, solid, a small piece of civilization in this wild place. Inside the alcove, the air was still and cool. She slumped against the rock wall, the silence that followed the storm's roar a deafening presence. The mule huddled near the entrance, its breathing a ragged counterpoint to her own hammering heart. For the first time since the dust hit, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her situation. Alone, lost, somewhere in the borderlands, a place whispered about in cow camps and railroad depots, a place of ghosts and hard men, a place where the Chiricahua Apache still hunted. The stories were currency in the camps. Men spoke of them in low voices, their words laced with a fear that was part respect and part pure hatred. They were phantoms who moved without sound, who struck and vanished, leaving only silence in their wake. But lately, another name had been added to the litany of fear's Silas Creed. He was a white man, they said, a former tracker for the patrols who now led a band of cutthroats. The rumor, passed along with coffee and stale biscuits, was that Creed's men were behind a string of raids on supply lines. They were clever, leaving behind just enough evidence a shod horse track scuffed to look unshod, an arrow left in a dead man to point the finger at the Apache. It was a convenient lie, one that fed the flames of hatred and kept the territory in a state of simmering war. Eve had paid the stories little mind. They were the talk of men, fueled by whiskey and boredom. Her world was governed by the rising of dough and the simmering of beans. But now, with the sun bleeding its last light through the dusty air, those stories felt chillingly real. She was in their country, all of it. She made a cold camp. No fire. A fire was a signal, a beacon for any eye, friendly or otherwise. She gnawed on a piece of hardtack from her satchel, the dry crumbs a poor substitute for a real meal. Her chapped lips cracked, and the metallic tang of her own blood mixed with the dust in her mouth. She offered the last of the water from her canteen to the mule, stroking its coarse neck. They were in this together. As darkness consumed the last of the light, A profound loneliness settled over her. She was 25 years old. Her mother was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through a mining town when Eve was 16. Her father, a man who had chased dreams of gold from one dusty camp to another, had simply walked into the mountains one day and never returned. Since then, she had made her own way. Her skillet and her mother's book her only inheritance. She had never known a man's touch, never had a home that was not the back of a wagon. Life was a thing to be endured, a series of camps to be left, a constant battle against hunger and solitude. Sleep was a shallow, skittish thing. Every scrape of a rock, every sigh of the wind was a threat. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the moon cast long, skeletal shadows across the land, she was startled awake. A sound, or the absence of one, had pulled her from her doze. She sat bolt upright, every muscle tense. The air was still. The mule shifted its weight, a soft, shuffling sound. And then she saw them on the patch of sandy ground just outside the alcove, illuminated by the cold moonlight. Footprints. One was huge, the unmistakable track of a grizzly, its claw marks gouging the earth. Her heart seized, but it was the other print, set neatly beside it, that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the print of a human foot, but not one made by a boot. It was the soft, distinct outline of a moccasin. He had been here, while she slept. He had stood right there. He had looked in on her. He had seen her, vulnerable and alone, and had moved on. Why? The rest of the night was a vigil. Eve sat with her back pressed to the cold stone, her heaviest skillet clutched in her lap. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was iron, and it was hers. She watched the shadows, her imagination populating them with silent, merciless figures. The stories, the warnings, the fearful boasts of men around campfires. They all came rushing back, a tide of terror that threatened to pull her under. She was a lone white woman, a prize, a target. She recited the Lord's Prayer until her lips were numb, the words a shield against the crushing darkness. Dawn arrived not with a bang, but with a slow, gray leaking of light that diluted the night's terrors. The world outside her shelter was painted in muted shades of brown and gray. The land scrubbed clean by the storm. The air was sharp and cold. She rose on stiff limbs, her body aching from the cold and tension. The footprints were still there, a silent testament to her unseen visitor. She forced herself to move, to check on the mule, to pack her few belongings. To stay was to die. To move was a chance, however slim. She had to find the trail, had to find people, any people. As she was cinching the strap on her spiced chest, a shadow fell over the entrance of the alcove. Eve didn't scream. The sound was trapped in her throat, a solid lump of ice. She turned slowly, the skillet still in her hand. He stood there, as silent as the rock he seemed to have sprung from. He was tall for an Apache, lean and hard, with muscle coiled like rope beneath his buckskin shirt. His black hair was held back by a simple cloth band. His face was all sharp angles and unforgiving planes, a face shaped by sun and wind. A thin, pale scar cut a diagonal line across his left cheekbone, pulling ever so slightly at the corner of his eye, giving him an expression of perpetual, weary watchfulness. He held a bow in one hand, and a quiver of arrows was slung across his back. He was not a phantom. He was terribly, breathtakingly real. They stood in silence for a long moment, the space between them charged with 1,000 unspoken questions and a single, overriding fear. Eve's fear. He simply watched her, his dark eyes unreadable. He looked at her face, at the skillet in her hands, at the mule huddled behind her. His gaze was not menacing, but it was intense, a deep and thorough assessment that stripped her bare of any pretense. She expected a grunt, a command in a language she could not understand. She expected the sudden violence the camp stories had promised. Instead, he spoke, and his voice, though quiet, filled the small space. The words were English, spoken slowly, deliberately, with a soft, guttural accent. "You are lost." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Eve could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He took a step forward, and she flinched, raising the skillet slightly. His eyes flickered to the heavy iron pan, and for the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible expression crossed his face. It might have been amusement. It might have been pity. He stopped. From a pouch at his waist, he withdrew a strip of dried meat in a small, tightly woven water basket. He held them out to her, an offering. Eve stared at his outstretched hand, at the food and water, and her mind struggled to reconcile this reality with the terrifying specter from her nightmares. This was not the savage from the stories. This was a man offering aid. Her hand trembled as she reached out and took the gifts. Her fingers brushed against his, and his skin was warm, calloused, and dry. The simple human contact was a shock, a jolt that seemed to start her heart beating again. "Thank you," she whispered, the words rusty from disuse. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. His eyes scanned the landscape outside the alcove, his focus shifting from her to the wider world. He seemed to be listening to something she could not hear, reading a language written on the wind. When he looked back at her, his expression was serious. "Do not build a high fire," he said, his voice low and firm. "There are manhunters, not us." Manhunters! The phrase hung in the cold air. She thought of Silas Creed, of the rumors of fake tracks and stolen goods, of men who hunted other men for profit, using the Apache as their scapegoats. Was that what he meant? He seemed to understand the question in her eyes. He gestured vaguely to the south, the direction she had been heading. They wait on the trail, for wagons. An ambush. The word formed in her mind, cold and sharp. Silas Creed's men. If the storm had not hit, if she had not been separated from the train, she would be driving her mule right into it. The silence stretched again, but it was different now. The terror that had held her in its grip was receding, replaced by a dawning, complex understanding. The man she had been taught to fear had just saved her life. The danger was not him. The danger wore familiar faces. He turned to leave, his movement as fluid and silent as pouring water. "Wait," she called out, her voice stronger now. "Where should I go?" He paused at the edge of the shelter and looked back at her over his shoulder. "The trail is a trap. You come." It was not a request. It was a quiet command, an invitation to a path she could not see. To follow him was to place her life in the hands of a man she should, by all accounts, consider her enemy. To refuse was to face the wilderness and Silas Creed's ambush alone. She looked at the strip of jerky in her hand, at the water basket. She looked at the solid weight of her skillet, the symbol of her self-reliance, and then she looked at him, at the quiet strength in his posture, at the truth she had heard in his slow, careful words. Survival was a matter of choices, often between two impossibilities. Her mother's recipe book was full of instructions on how to turn tough meat tender, how to make something nourishing from scraps. This was no different. It was a recipe for staying alive. She took a deep breath, the cold air a balm on her raw throat. She loaded the spice chest onto the mule, her movements sure and steady. She picked up the lead rope. "I am ready," she said. The Apache warrior, Nantan, gave a final, assessing look. He turned without a word and began to walk, not towards the trail, but away from it, into the broken, rocky country that was his home. And Evelyn Hart, with her mother's skillet and the future of her world uncertain, followed his footprints into the unknown. A fragile alliance had been forged in dust and fear, a first, tentative step onto a new and dangerous path. The journey was an exercise in silence. Nantan moved through the broken land with a quiet economy of motion that made him seem a part of it, like a shadow given substance. He did not look back to see if Evelyn followed. He simply knew she was there, for her part. Eve focused on the ground, on placing her feet where he had placed his, on guiding the mule over treacherous scree and through thorny thickets of mesquite. The world was a vast, silent testament to endurance, and she was a small, fragile note within it. They arrived at the camp as the sun was setting, casting the Peloncillo Mountains in hues of bruised purple and soft rose. It was not what she had imagined. There were no rows of teepees, no great herds of horses. It was a small, temporary settlement of a half-dozen wickiups, domed structures of branches and hides, tucked into a box canyon that offered protection from the wind and prying eyes. A thin tendril of smoke, carefully controlled, rose from a central fire pit. A few lean dogs raised their heads and offered low growls, but did not bark. Every eye turned to her. Women stopped their work, their hands still in baskets of dried beans. A handful of children peeked from behind the safety of a hide curtain, their dark eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. The few men present, old and young, watched with a stony, unreadable stillness. This was not the welcome of a savior. It was the wary assessment of a threat. A man stepped forward to meet Nantan, his movements sharp and agitated where Nantan's were fluid. He was built like a block of granite, his face a mask of aggressive suspicion. He spoke to Nantan in the quick, guttural clicks and flows of the Apache tongue, his eyes never leaving Eve. He gestured toward her, then toward the trail they had left, his meaning clear even without translation. He was angry. He saw her as a danger, a harbinger of the very trouble they sought to avoid. Nantan replied in a low, even tone. His voice carried no apology, only fact. The other man, whom Nantan called Chato, spat on the ground, a clear expression of his disgust. He looked at Eve as if she were a snake Nantan had foolishly brought into their home. An old woman emerged from the largest wickiup. Her face was a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, each line a story of survival. Her hair, streaked with gray, was tied back neatly, and she moved with the slow, deliberate grace of one who has earned her authority. She looked at Eve, her gaze sharp and intelligent, taking in the frayed hem of her dress, the exhaustion in her posture, and the determined set of her jaw. She was, Eve would learn, Naiche, the clan's matriarch and advisor. Naiche said something to Nantan, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight. He answered, and a silent conversation passed between them, a language of glances and faint gestures. Finally, Naiche nodded slowly and pointed a bony finger toward a clear space near the canyon wall. Permission. Eve understood. She was not a guest. She was a problem to be solved. A stray creature brought in from the cold. Her worth, her very right to exist in this small space, was yet to be determined. She unloaded her chest and her skillet, her movements stiff and clumsy under the weight of so many hostile stares. She set up her small camp, a territory of a few square feet defined by the presence of her mother's belongings. Hunger was a palpable presence in the camp. It was in the gauntness of the dogs, the hollows in the children's cheeks, the grim set of the men's mouths. An early, unseasonable frost had whitened the high ground, a harbinger of a harsh winter. The trade routes, their source for flour and coffee, had been choked off by the threat of Silas Creed's raids. The land was providing, but barely. Nantan appeared at her side, as silent as a thought. He laid 2 freshly skinned rabbits at her feet. He said nothing, but the message was clear. Prove yourself. Eve opened her chest. The familiar scents of cinnamon, cumin, and dried thyme rose to greet her. A small piece of a world far from this canyon. She took out her skillet, its surface black and smooth from years of use. She worked with a focused intensity, shutting out the eyes that watched her every move. This was her ground. In the geography of the fire, she was the master. She built a small fire, as Nantan had instructed, its flames barely licking the bottom of the pan. She jointed the rabbits with practiced skill, dusted them with flour and salt, and seared them in a little of the precious bacon fat she carried in a tin. The sound and smell of the sizzling meat caused a visible stir in the camp. A small boy, no older than 5, with huge, soulful eyes, crept closer. He was Ashki, Nantan's orphaned cousin, a small shadow who moved with a heartbreaking quietness. Into the pot with the rabbit went wild onions Nantan had provided, a handful of toasted piñon nuts for richness, and water from her own canteen. She added a pinch of thyme and a bay leaf from her chest. It was a simple soup, a peasant's meal, but she coaxed the flavor from it with the patience and skill her mother had taught her. She let it simmer slowly, the aroma weaving through the camp, a promise of warmth and sustenance. It was a declaration, I am not a burden. I am a cook. When the soup was ready, thick and fragrant, a deep, savory brown, no one moved. The suspicion was a wall between them. Eve ladled a small amount into a tin cup and held it out to Ashki. The boy looked to Nietzsche for permission. The old woman watched Eve for a long moment, her eyes seeming to weigh Eve's very soul. Then she gave a slight, regal nod. Ashki took the cup in both hands and drank, his small face serious. His eyes widened. He took another, deeper sip, the warmth spreading through him. A small smile touched his lips. That was all it took. Nietzsche came forward and accepted a cup. She sipped it slowly, her eyes closed, savoring the taste. She opened them and looked at Eve. And in their depths, Eve saw not suspicion, but a profound, weary understanding. The old woman spoke in a quiet voice. "It is rich," she said in passable English, "but not burned." It was the highest praise Eve could have imagined. Soon, others came forward with their cups and bowls, Chato being the last, his movements still grudging. The camp grew quiet as they ate. The only sounds the soft scraping of spoons and the crackle of the fire, for the first time since she had become lost. Eve felt a flicker of something other than fear. She had spoken to them in a language they all understood. Later, as the stars began to glitter in the cold, clear sky, Eve made her proposal. She stood before Nantan and Nietzsche, Chato hovering nearby like a thundercloud. "Your people need food for the winter," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The trade routes are not safe. I need safe passage to the town of Santo Lobo. There is a mail post there. I can find work." She paused, letting the words settle. "I will cook for your people. For a few weeks, I will use what you hunt and gather, and what I have in my chest. In return, when the way is clear, you will guide me over the mountains to the town." It was a fair trade, a contract between equals. Chato snorted, speaking in Apache to Nantan. Eve caught the name Silas Creed. Chato's meaning was clear. She was one of them. The whites, the people who paid men like Creed to drive the Apache from their lands. How could she be trusted? Nantan was silent, his face troubled. He was torn. The laws of his people were strict about outsiders. To bring one into their hidden camp was a risk beyond measure. She could be a spy. She could bring soldiers. She could bring sickness. His responsibility was to his people, and every instinct for their preservation screamed against her proposal. It was Nietzsche who broke the stalemate. She placed a hand on Nantan's arm, her touch both gentle and firm. "Nantan," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of 100 winters. "Look at the children. Look at the sky. The cold season comes early. A hand that can cook is a hand that cures hunger." She turned her piercing gaze on Eve. "She does not have the eyes of a liar. She has the hands of a worker." Eve knew this was her moment. Words were not enough. She needed to seal the bargain with another offering. The next day, when a hunter brought in a small deer, she set to work again. She showed them how to make tender a tough cut of venison, stewing it for hours with the dried red chilies from her chest until it fell apart. And then she did something more. She had watched the women grinding corn on a flat stone. She asked for some of the meal. She mixed it with water and a little salt, forming it into flat cakes. Nietzsche, seeing her intent, showed her which river stones were best. Eve heated them in the embers of the fire until they were scorching hot. She placed the cakes of dough on the stones, and the heat cooked them through. leaving them crisp on the outside and soft within. It was their food, their method. The hot stones, buried in the ash like the very heart of the earth, held the heat and gave it back as life. She served the venison chili with the hot cornbread. The meal was a communion. She had taken from their world and hers and made something new. She had shown respect. She had proven her worth not with weapons or words, but with the honest labor of her hands. That evening, the decision was made. They would accept her offer. But as Eve lay in her bedroll, listening to the sounds of the sleeping camp, she felt a profound shift within herself. A few weeks, it wasn't enough. The snow was coming. To leave them halfway through the winter, to take her newfound safety and abandon them to their hunger, felt like a betrayal. And what waited for her in Santo Lobo, a town full of men who hated the people who had just saved her life. A town that might see her as a collaborator, a traitor to her own kind. The next morning, she went to Nantan. Nietzsche and Chato stood with him. "I have changed my mind," she said simply. "A few weeks is not enough. The snow will be deep. I will stay through the winter. I will cook for your people until the spring thaw." The three of them stared at her, stunned into silence by the magnitude of her offer. It was no longer a contract. It was a commitment, a bond. Chato's eyes narrowed, still searching for the trap. Nietzsche's expression softened, a deep respect dawning in her eyes. Nantan simply watched her, his gaze intense, searching. "I have one condition," Eve continued, her voice unwavering. She pointed to the wooden chest that held her spices, her Bible, and her mother's recipe book. "This is mine. It holds the memory of my mother. It is my trade and my soul. No one is to touch it. No one is to look inside it without my permission. My skillet, my chest, they are my space." She was drawing a line, not of hostility, but of selfhood. In this world where she had nothing, these few things were the anchor of who she was. Nantan looked at the chest, then back at her. He understood. It was a promise of respect she was asking for, a boundary that even in their communal life must not be crossed. He gave a single, solemn nod. "It will be as you say," he said. "I will see to it." His words were a vow. He was no longer just her rescuer or her guide. He was her guarantor, the protector of her small, sacred space. A trust had been forged, not in the fire, but beside it. And as the first flakes of snow began to drift down from the gray sky, Evelyn Hart knew she had traded one kind of wilderness for another, and that her survival now depended not just on a skillet, but on the word of a silent Apache warrior. Life in the canyon settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the stomach. The days grew shorter, the nights sharper. A routine, simple and profound, became the scaffolding of Evelyn's existence. She rose before dawn, the air a shock of cold against her skin, and coaxed the communal fire back to life. The first thing she touched each day was her skillet, its familiar weight a comfort in the pre-dawn gloom. She learned the names of the plants Nietzsche brought her, the earthy taste of yucca root, the subtle sweetness of boiled agave hearts. She learned which wood burned hot and fast, and which smoldered slow, perfect for stewing tough meat into submission. The children, led by the quiet and watchful Ashki, became her small helpers. They gathered firewood, hauled water in clay jars, and watched, fascinated, as she transformed their meager supplies into meals that were not just filling, but flavorful. She taught them to count using dried beans and to recognize the letters of her English alphabet, which she wrote with charcoal on a piece of scraped hide. In these small acts of labor and sharing, a fragile trust began to grow. Chato's glares became less frequent, replaced by a grudging respect when she managed to make a broth that soothed a teething baby's gums. The women would sometimes leave her small offerings by her sleeping roll: a pretty stone, a bird's feather, a handful of sweet berries, and Nantan, though he rarely spoke to her directly, was a constant, silent presence. He ensured her woodpile was never low and that her water buckets were full. Sometimes, in the evening, she would see him watching her from across the fire, the scar on his cheekbone stark in the flickering light, his expression unreadable but intent. This quiet, precarious peace was shattered by the return of 2 scouts from a long reconnaissance. They slipped into camp like ghosts just after dusk, their faces grim, their bodies lean with hard travel. They brought with them a cold wind of news that extinguished the warmth of the fire. Eve was serving a thick pinto bean soup when they arrived. She listened as they spoke in low, urgent tones to Nantan and Naiche. She did not need to understand the Apache words to read the story in their exhausted postures and the grim set of their mouths. She saw the men's hands clench, the women pull their children closer. The atmosphere in the camp changed in an instant, from weary contentment to a sharp, coiled tension. Later, Naiche came to her. The old woman's face was etched with a deep weariness. A freight wagon was taken, she said, her English slow and heavy, the one carrying winter flour and salt for the mining camps. All the men were killed. Eve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Was it Silas Creed?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Naiche nodded. "The soldiers from the fort came. They found tracks, our tracks." She paused, her dark eyes locking with Eve's. The tracks were lies, made with a board, carved to look like a moccasin, pressed into the ground next to the tracks of shod horses. But the soldiers only saw what they wanted to see. The deception was as cruel as it was clever. It was a poison poured into the well of an already deep mistrust. Nantan and Chato left before dawn the next day. They carried no food, only their weapons and water. They moved with a grim purpose that tightened the knot of fear in Eve's stomach. They were gone for 2 days. The camp was a place of anxious whispers and watchful waiting. Eve kept the fire going, the pot full. The simple, domestic act of cooking felt like a prayer, a spell to ward off the encroaching darkness. She would find herself leaving a faint trail of cornmeal from the cook fire to her sleeping place, a habit from her life on the trail, a way to find her way back in the dark. Now, the small act felt foolish, a relic of a life where her only concern was herself. When Nantan returned, he was alone, and he carried the truth in his hand. He walked directly to the fire where Eve was stirring a pot and held out his open palm. Lying in the center was a small, brassy cylinder of metal, dull and unremarkable. "A shell casing," she said, recognizing it from the 100 of such things she had seen littering the ground in cow camps. "Henry rifle," Nantan said, his voice flat, .44 caliber. He looked around the small circle of men who had gathered. "We do not have this gun. Our rifles are older, different bullets." This was proof, hard, undeniable proof that the attackers were not his people. The weapon belonged to the white man's world, a world of repeating rifles and manufactured ammunition. Silas Creed. Chato arrived hours later, his face a thundercloud of fury. He had come from a different direction, from the ridges overlooking the town of Santo Lobo. What he had heard there was worse than the attack itself. He spoke in a torrent of enraged Apache, his words striking the listeners like stones. Eve looked to Naiche, who translated, her voice heavy with sorrow and disgust. "There is a new sign in the town, posted by the sheriff. Money. For any Apache, man, woman, or child. A bounty, a license to kill, nailed to a post for all to see." The lies of Silas Creed had borne their bitter fruit. The freight company wanted revenge. The land agent who secretly paid Creed wanted the Apache gone, and the town wanted blood. It was a perfect, vicious circle. In that moment, Evelyn Hart was caught between 2 worlds, and each was a threat. She could leave. Nantan had promised her safe passage. She could slip away, make her way to Santo Lobo, and melt back into the world she knew. She would be safe, but her safety would be purchased with silence. Her departure would be another piece of evidence. The white woman who escaped the savages, her story twisted to fit their narrative of lies. She would be helping them hang the noose. Or she could stay. If she stayed, she was no longer a neutral survivor. She was an ally, a member of the camp, in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of every white person in Santo Lobo. She would be a collaborator, a traitor. There would be no going back. She looked around the fire. She saw Ashki, his small face pale with a fear he did not understand, clutching a piece of cornbread she had made for him. She saw Naiche, her back straight, her spirit unbent by a lifetime of such injustices. She saw the faces of the women, the men, the people who had taken her in, who had judged her not by the color of her skin but by the work of her hands. She thought of the faint trail of cornmeal she kept leaving, her path back to a life of solitude. With a sweep of her foot, she brushed the last of it into the dust, erasing the path. The ashes from the cook fire felt more real, more a part of her now. Those ashes represented warmth, community, a shared struggle against the cold. Her choice was made. The next few days were taut with a terrible, waiting silence. The camp was moved deeper into the canyon, to a place more easily defended. Sentries were posted on the high rocks day and night. The wind carried a new, menacing sound on its breath, the distant, mournful baying of hounds. They came at night. Not the men, but their scouts, the dogs. Their howling grew closer, a ragged, hungry sound that echoed off the canyon walls. They were hunting, sniffing the air for the scent of the camp, for the scent of the people Silas Creed had marked for death. Panic flickered through the camp like a wind-whipped flame. Chato and the other men grabbed their rifles, their faces set and ready to fight. "No," Nantan said, his voice a low command. "A fight is what they want. It will bring the others."
"We cannot let the dogs find us," Chato snarled. "They will lead the whole pack to our door."
Eve's mind raced. The dogs were hunting by scent, the scent of humans, the scent of wood smoke, the scent of food. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her kitchen, her domain, was a liability. But perhaps it could also be a weapon. "I have an idea," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. Everyone turned to look at her. "A false trail, a false camp. We can lead the dogs away." Nantan looked at her, his eyes sharp, questioning. "I need a fire," she said, thinking fast. "Away from here, downwind. And I need meat, the oldest, strongest smelling meat you have. And chilies, all the dried chilies I have left." Understanding dawned on Nantan's face. A ghost camp, a lure made of smoke and scent. It was a risk, but it was better than waiting for the hounds to find them. He gave a sharp nod and issued a series of quiet orders. Minutes later, Eve was scrambling down a narrow game trail, her skillet in one hand, her precious chest of spices banging against the mule's flank. Nantan and another warrior moved ahead of her, silent as shadows. They found a small clearing a half-mile from the camp, a place where a sharp turn in the canyon would carry the scent away from their true location. She worked with frantic speed, her hands sure and steady despite the fear that made her stomach clench. She built a fire, not the small, careful fire she used in camp, but a smoky, green wood fire that coughed out thick clouds of smoke. She threw the last of her bacon fat into the skillet, where it sputtered and popped, releasing its rich, salty perfume into the night air. Then she added the strips of aging venison they had given her. The meat seared and smoked, its odor strong and gamey. The baying of the hounds was closer now, a frantic, excited chorus. They had the scent. "The chilies," Nantan said, his voice a low growl at her side. Eve grabbed the cloth bag from her chest and dumped the entire contents, a double handful of dried red chilies, into the sizzling fat. The effect was immediate and violent. A thick, acrid smoke billowed from the pan, so pungent it made her eyes water and her throat burn. The smell of the chilies, combined with the greasy, smoking meat, created a powerful, almost overwhelming stench that the wind immediately seized and carried down the canyon. "It is enough," Nantan said. He grabbed her arm and pulled her back into the shadows of the rocks. "Now, we wait." They crouched in the darkness, listening. The howling grew louder, a frenzy of sound. They could hear the dogs crashing through the underbrush, their paws scrabbling on the rocks. They burst into the clearing,
A pack of lean, hungry hounds, their eyes wild in the firelight. They lunged for the smoking skillet, barking and snarling, fighting over the foul-smelling bait.
A moment later, the sound of men's voices and horses followed. Silas Creed's men. They rode into the edge of the firelight, their figures dark and menacing.
"Nothing here." One of them grumbled. "Just a cook fire. Must have heard us coming and run off."
"Damn dogs." Another voice, rougher and deeper, spat. Eve guessed it was Creed. Get 'em on a leash before they eat that burnt mess and get sick. They could hear the men cursing and fighting to get the dogs under control. The lure had worked perfectly. They believed they had found an abandoned camp. After a few minutes of noise and confusion, the sounds began to fade as the men and their dogs moved on. Following the false trail down the wrong fork of the canyon, Eve, Nantan, and the other warrior remained hidden until the last echo of the hounds had faded into the night. The silence that descended was thick and profound. They were safe. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. Nantan looked at her in the dim, dying light of the decoy fire. The usual mask of stoicism was gone from his face, replaced by an expression of deep, undisguised respect. He did not say thank you. The words were not necessary. They had faced the shadow of Silas Creed together. She had chosen her side, and with a skillet and a handful of chilies, she had defended it. The trust between them, once a fragile seedling, had just put down deep and solid roots. They were no longer just a cook and a warrior. They were allies in a war of lies, fighting for their lives in the dark heart of the night. The night of the false fire changed something. The air in the camp, once thick with a cautious, watchful suspicion, now held a new quality. It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a shared space, a circle of warmth that now included the white woman and her skillet. Evelyn's act had not been one of charity, but of cunning and courage. She had used the tools of her own world, a cook's tools, to defend theirs. It was a language the Chiricahua understood perfectly. A new education began for her, a slow unspooling of the desert's secrets. Naiche became her tutor. The old woman's hands, gnarled as mesquite root, were endlessly clever. She showed Eve how to slice the pads of the prickly pear cactus, burning off the spines to reveal the tender green flesh within, a vegetable that tasted of earth and rain. She taught her to strip the fibrous leaves of the yucca and beat them against a rock until they frothed into a fragrant, cleansing soap that left her skin feeling clean for the first time in weeks. They would sit together for hours, stripping long pieces of venison into thin ribbons to be dried on a rack, using the hooked thorns of a dead cholla cactus to hang the meat so that it would not touch the wood. In these quiet lessons, very few words were spoken. A gesture, a grunt of approval, a shared look of satisfaction when a task was done right. This was their conversation. In return, Eve offered the knowledge from her own world. The children, who had at first treated her like a strange, unpredictable creature, now gathered around her after the morning meal. With Ashki as her most solemn and attentive pupil, she would pour a measure of flour onto a flat, dark stone and trace the shapes of letters. A was for agave. B was for bean. She taught them their numbers by having them count out piñon nuts into piles of 10. It was a small, fragile bridge between their worlds, built of flour and patience. Nantan remained a quiet enigma, but his presence became a fixed point in her day. Each evening, after the final meal was shared and the camp settled into a low murmur, he would sit by the fire's edge and tend to his weapons. The rhythmic scrape of a whetstone on his knife's steel became a familiar sound, a sort of lullaby of readiness. He would check the fletching on his arrows, his long, deft fingers moving with an absolute and certain grace. He never hurried. His attention to the tools of his survival was a form of prayer. One day, he appeared at her side as she was scrubbing her skillet with sand. He held a digging stick. "The agave is ready," he said. She followed him out of the canyon, her mule trailing behind. He led her to a place where the broad, spiny plants grew in thick clusters. He moved with a knowledge that was bone deep, showing her how to spot the plants that were fat with a sweet liquid at their core. He worked in a focused silence, his powerful shoulders moving with an easy strength as he dug around the base of a plant, severing its roots. He showed her how to use the sharp edge of a rock to hack away the tough, spiky leaves to get to the heart, a dense, pale prize that looked like a giant pineapple. They worked together all afternoon, a team bound by a common purpose. He did the heavy work of digging, and she did the trimming, her smaller, nimbler hands better suited to the task. They learned the rhythm of each other's movements, a silent dance of labor. She began to understand his language of silence. A slight tilt of his head meant to watch out for a snake. A hand held up for a moment meant to be still and listen to the wind. She, in turn, could tell by the set of his shoulders if he was pleased with their work, or by the slight narrowing of his eyes that he was watching the horizon. Ever vigilant. In this shared silence, in the simple, honest work of gathering food, she felt a connection to him that was more real than any polite conversation she had ever had in her life. That evening, the camp feasted on the agave hearts, roasted for hours in a pit filled with hot stones until they were soft, sweet, and smoky. The children's faces were sticky with the sweet syrup. It was a good day, a day of plenty. As she was banking the coals of the main fire for the night, wrapping precious embers in a blanket of ash to save them for the morning, Nietzsche sat down beside her. The old woman was watching Chato across the fire, who was playing a game with his young son, a rare smile on his hard face.
"It is good," Nietzsche said softly, "to see a man be a father."
Eve nodded, her heart aching with a sudden, sharp pang of loneliness. She had never known that kind of family, that simple, easy contentment.
"You are a good woman, Evelyn Hart,"
Nietzsche continued, her voice gentle.
"You work hard. A man would be lucky to have you."
The words were meant as a kindness, a compliment, but they landed on Eve with a complicated weight. She looked at her hands, the knuckles chapped, the nails broken from her work. She thought of her solitary life, the endless journey from one temporary place to another.
"I have never known a man—" "Nietzsche,"
she said, her voice quiet but clear. The admission was not shameful, but it was a truth she had never spoken aloud. There was no time. My mother fell ill, and then she was gone. My father, he left, surviving took all my hours. There was no room for anything else. The statement hung in the cool night air. It was a declaration of a life lived on the edge, a life of profound and lonely self-reliance. Nietzsche placed a warm, dry hand over Eve's. "To survive is a great thing," she said. "It is the first law." Nantan had been standing in the shadows just beyond the firelight he had heard. He stepped forward, and Eve's first instinct was a hot flush of embarrassment to have her private history laid bare before him. But his face held no pity. It held only a deep, quiet consideration. She felt a sudden need to make things clear, to draw a line around herself that was not made of fear, but of dignity. She stood up and faced him, her chin held high. "I did not stay here for a husband or for protection," she said, her voice steady. "I stayed to do my work. I am here to cook and to be a person. I am not a prize to be won, or a spoil of war." It was a bold statement, a challenge to the unspoken assumptions that governed the world she had come from. She was defining the terms of her own existence. Nantan was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes holding hers. The firelight played across the scar on his face. She saw a flicker of something in his expression, a deep and ancient sorrow that he kept carefully banked, like the coals of the fire. She knew, in that instant, that he understood loss. He had his own ghosts. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and resonant. "Your fire," he said, looking from her to the glowing heart of the coals she had just tended, "is the fire of us all." He was not just talking about the cook fire. He was talking about her spirit, her will, the stubborn life force that had brought her to this place and kept her going. He was acknowledging her as the center of their small community, the one who provided the warmth and sustenance that held them together. He saw her not as a woman, not as a white person, but as the keeper of the hearth. In his world, there was no higher honor. A few days later, word came that a patrol was moving through the foothills, sweeping the area in response to the bounty. They were not looking for Silas Creed. They were looking for Apache. Nantan knew he had to go out, to watch them, to lead them away from the canyon if necessary. It was a dangerous task. A lone scout, if discovered, would be shot on sight. As he prepared to leave, checking his bowstring and filling a small pouch with dried meat, Eve felt a cold dread grip her. The thought of him out there alone, hunted, was unbearable. She went to her chest and opened the small, hidden compartment where she kept her mother's things. She took out a small silver charm, a simple, hammered disc on a leather thong. It had been her mother's, worn smooth with years of touch. It was the only beautiful thing she owned. She went to him as he was tying his moccasins. He looked up, his face impassive. She held out the charm. "My mother said this would always show you the way home," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Take it, so you will remember the way back." It was a deeply personal offering, a piece of her own history, her own heart. He looked at the silver disc shining in her palm, then at her face. He did not reach for it. For a moment, she thought he would refuse it, that the gift was too intimate, a boundary crossed. But then he held out his hand, not for the thong, but for the charm itself. He took it from her and held it in his palm, its coolness a contrast to the warmth of his skin. He did not put it around his neck. That would have been a public declaration, a claiming. Instead, he took out his knife, with a small, sharp awl from his pouch. He carefully pierced 2 small holes in the thick leather of the knife's sheath. Then, using a strand of sinew, he carefully, methodically, stitched the silver charm firmly to the sheath. The act was more intimate than any embrace. He was binding her gift, her prayer for his safety, to the tool he depended on for his very life. It would not be a piece of jewelry, easily lost or displayed. It would be a part of him, a silent, secret promise tucked away next to the cold, hard steel of his blade. It was a vow made not with words, but with sinew and silver. He slid the knife back into its place at his hip. The silver charm was a small, pale moon against the dark, worn leather. He looked at her, and, for the first time, she saw a clear and unguarded warmth in his eyes. He gave a single, brief nod. It was all the thanks she needed. Then he turned and melted into the shadows of the canyon, leaving her with the image of her mother's charm, now standing sentinel over the heart of his survival. Nantan returned with the first gray light of dawn, materializing at the edge of the camp not as a man, but as a piece of the morning shadow that had detached itself from the rocks. He was coated in dust and rimed with frost, and the lines of exhaustion on his face were carved deep. But it was the look in his eyes that silenced the waking camp. It was a cold, hard light, the reflection of a terrible certainty. He carried a fresh report, not in words, but in the grim set of his jaw. He went directly to Nietzsche's wickiup, with Chato following a step behind, his body radiating a tense, aggressive energy. Eve's hands, which had been kneading a heavy corn dough, stilled. She watched the entrance of the wickiup, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The brief interlude of peace was over. The wolf was at the door again. When they emerged, Nantan's face was a mask of stone. He gathered the half-dozen able-bodied men of their small band. He spoke in low, rapid Apache, his voice the sound of stones grinding together. Chato paced back and forth, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, his anger a palpable force. Eve went to Nietzsche, who was watching the men with an expression of profound sorrow. "What is it?" Eve asked. What did he see? "Creed," the old woman said.
The name itself a curse. He sets a trap, not for us, this time for a trading party. From the south.
Traders. 2 men from Mexico, Nietzsche explained, her voice heavy. They bring silver goods to trade for hides. They have a boy with them, half Navajo. They are good men. They have traded with our people before. Creed will take their goods, and he will leave our arrows in their bodies. The soldiers will come, and they will say the Apache have broken the peace again. It was the same poison, a different victim. The plan was designed to turn everyone against them, to paint them as treacherous killers who preyed even on those who showed them friendship. Where Eve asked, "Arroyo Seco," Nietzsche said, gesturing with her chin toward a deep cleft in the distant mesas. A dry creek bed, a bad place, high walls, soft sand, easy to go in, hard to get out. Chatto's voice rose in anger. He wanted a direct attack, to meet Creed's men head-on, to answer violence with violence. It was a brave plan, and a foolish one. They were outnumbered 3-1. A direct fight would be a slaughter. Nantan's voice cut through Chatto's tirade, sharp and final. He was arguing for caution, for a plan that did not involve sacrificing his men for a victory that would solve nothing. He needed to stop the attack, but he also needed to preserve his people. Eve looked from one man to the other. She saw the rage, born of injustice, in Chatto's eyes. She saw the heavy weight of responsibility in Nantan's. And then she thought of the night they had turned back the hounds. She thought of the stinging, choking cloud that had billowed from her skillet. Smoke, not just to hide, but to disable. She stepped forward into the circle of men. "There is another way," she said. Every head turned to her. Chatto looked at her with open disbelief. "Smoke," she said, looking directly at Nantan. "Like before, but more, stronger." Her mind was racing, her cook's inventory of scents and properties becoming a list of armaments. The chilies work. They burn the eyes and the throat, but if we add other things, green pinyon branches, they make a thick, bitter smoke. And coffee. Coffee, Chatto scoffed. "Burned," Eve explained. "Burned coffee grounds. The smoke is oily, thick. It clings to everything and you cannot breathe it. We can make a wall of it, a choking fog. We can blind them without firing a single shot." A silence fell over the group as they considered her words. It was the weapon of a woman, a weapon from the kitchen, but it was also a weapon that did not require superior numbers or better rifles. It was the weapon of the clever, not the strong. Nantan's eyes held hers. He was seeing the plan, seeing the shape of it. He knew the terrain of the arroyo, the way the wind moved through it. He could see how her wall of smoke could be used. "The wind must be right," he said, thinking aloud. "It must blow down the canyon." "We will wait until it is," he decided, his voice firm. He turned to Eve. "You will come. You and the mule. You will be our cannon." Arroyo Seco was a jagged wound in the earth. The walls were steep and crumbling, a sun-baked tapestry of red rock and pale sand. The creek bed itself was a wide, treacherous path of loose gravel and patches of sand that could suck a horse's hoof down in an instant. Creed had chosen his killing ground well. His men were hidden among the boulders and scrub on the high banks, their rifles glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. They were patient hunters, waiting for their prey. Nantan, Chatto, Eve, and 2 other warriors lay on their bellies on the opposite rim of the canyon, a half-mile upwind from the ambush. From their vantage point, they could see everything. They saw the trader's wagon, a small, dusty speck, making its slow way toward the mouth of the arroyo. It was a pitifully small caravan. Just 2 men on horseback and a boy driving the wagon. "The wind is turning," Nantan whispered, his face pressed to the warm rock. He could feel the shift, the subtle change in pressure. The way the dust devils in the distance began to spin in a new direction. "It is time," he said. Eve's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. This was real. Men would be hurt. This was not a game of smoke and shadows. She untied the heavy sack from her mule. Inside were all the chilies she possessed, a bag of precious coffee grounds, and a bundle of green, resinous pinyon boughs. They moved quickly down a small side canyon that brought them to the floor of the arroyo, still out of sight of Creed's men. Here, the wind was a steady, flowing river of air, moving directly toward the ambush site. Eve worked with a desperate focus, her fear channeled into the familiar motions of her craft. She built 3 small fire pits, stuffing them with dry tinder. Nantan and the others piled the green pinyon branches beside them. She opened her skillet and poured in the coffee grounds, then dumped the chilies on top. "Now," Nantan commanded. The men lit the fires. As soon as the flames took hold, they began piling on the green branches. A thick, pungent, white smoke began to pour out, hugging the ground. At the same moment, Eve shoved her skillet into the hottest part of one of the fires. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The coffee grounds and chilies began to smolder, then burn, releasing a truly foul, choking cloud of greasy, black smoke. It smelled of pure acrid bitterness, a stench that assaulted the senses and clawed at the back of the throat. The white smoke of the pinyon and the black smoke from her skillet combined, creating a dense, rolling fog of poison that the wind pushed steadily down the arroyo. They heard the first coughs a minute later, then shouts of confusion and alarm. The beautiful, deadly smoke screen rolled over the ambush site, completely obscuring it from view. "Go," Nantan said to Chato and the other 2 warriors. "Get them out." The 3 men melted into the smoke, their knives drawn. Nantan stayed with Eve, his bow in his hand, his eyes scanning the roiling cloud. They could hear panicked shouts, the terrified whinnying of horses, and the raw, hacking coughs of men who were struggling for breath. Then came the sound of a gunshot, then another, fired blindly into the smoke. Suddenly, a figure stumbled out of the fog, his face red, his eyes streaming. It was one of Creed's men, gasping for air. He staggered right toward them, before he could even register their presence. Nantan was on him, a forearm across his throat, choking off his cry of alarm. The chaos in the arroyo intensified. Eve could hear the traders' voices now, shouting in Spanish, the boy crying out in fear. She saw Chato appear at the edge of the smoke, guiding the traders' horses, his face a grim mask of concentration. Then the leader himself emerged, Silas Creed. He was a big man, with a thick, untrimmed beard and pale, cruel eyes that were now red-rimmed and streaming with tears. He was not coughing. He was roaring with fury, a large revolver in his hand. He fired a shot toward the wagon, the sound deafening in the narrow space. As he raised his gun to fire again, Eve saw it. On the back of his right wrist, where his sleeve was pushed back, was a smear of dark purple. It was not a brand or a tattoo. It was an ink stain, the kind a man gets from a leaky fountain pen, the kind used by clerks and agents in town to sign deeds and contracts. It was the mark of a man who did business with paper and money, not just with guns. At that moment, a bullet whined past Nantan's head, fired by another of Creed's men who had stumbled into the clear. The shot was wild, but deadly close. Nantan ducked and moved, and as he did, the low afternoon sun caught the small silver charm stitched to his knife sheath. It flashed, a brilliant, blinding spark of light, a tiny star against the dark leather. It was a promise, a prayer, a piece of her mother's soul, winking in the midst of the violence. The battle, if it could be called that, was short and brutal. Chato and the others, protected from the worst of the smoke, used the confusion to their advantage. They were not there to kill. They were there to rescue. They cut the traces on the wagon horse and hustled the terrified traders and the boy out of the arroyo, pushing them toward the safety of the rocks. Creed, realizing he had lost control, roared at his men to retreat. They stumbled away through the smoke, firing blindly behind them, their ambush a miserable failure. In the aftermath, the arroyo was a scene of chaos. The air was still thick with the foul-smelling smoke. One of Creed's men lay on the ground, a deep gash in his leg, unable to run. Chato stood over him, his knife raised. his face a mask of cold fury. He was ready to finish it.
"No!" Nantan's voice cut through the air, a sharp command.
He walked over and kicked the rifle away from the wounded man's hand. He looked down at the man, who was trembling with a mixture of pain and terror. Chada was vibrating with the need for vengeance, for a final, bloody accounting. Nantan stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. He looked from the wounded man to Chado, his gaze hard and clear. Then he looked back at the henchman. "Live," Nantan said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a judge's sentence. "Live, and tell the truth of what happened here today." He turned and walked away, leaving the man to his fate. It was an act of mercy, but it was also a strategic masterstroke. A dead man tells no tales, but a live one, a witness, could be a weapon far more powerful than any knife. They guided the shaken traders to a safe place, a hidden spring in the rocks. The two men, whose names were Mateo and Hernan, could not stop thanking them. The boy, whose name was Little Sparrow, just stared at Nantan with wide, awestruck eyes. They told their story, how they had been warned that the trail was unsafe, but had to get their goods to the mining camps. Their testimony would prove that Creed, not the Apache, was the source of the danger. But as they made their cold camp that night, a new and chilling thought settled in Eve's mind. One of Creed's men had seen her. In the smoke and chaos, he had seen her face. The man Nantan had saved had seen all of them. The story that would be told in Santo Lobo would not be the truth. It would be a twisted version, a tale of a bloody attack by the Apache and their strange ally. A new rumor was being born in the dust of Arroyo Seco. It would travel faster than a horse, carried on the bitter winds of hatred and fear. The white cook who cooks for the Apache. She was no longer a ghost, a survivor who had vanished into the wilderness. She was a name, a face, a target. Her act of salvation had just made her the most wanted woman in the territory. The first snow came not as a gentle dusting, but as a thick, wet blanket, smothering the canyon in a sudden and profound silence. The world, which had been a symphony of browns, reds, and golds, was now a stark study in black rock and white powder. Winter had not arrived early. It had ambushed them. With the snow came the tightening grip of hunger. The stores of dried meat dwindled with alarming speed. The sacks of beans and cornmeal seemed to hollow out overnight. Every meal became a careful calculation, a balancing act between present need and future survival. This grim arithmetic fell to Evelyn. It was she who measured out the portions, her hands steady, her face a mask of calm impartiality. She made thin stews, stretching the flavor of a single rabbit to feed 20 people. She learned to bulk up the pots with fibrous roots and tough greens that in better times would have been ignored. Her fairness became a quiet law in the camp. The hunters, their faces gaunt, would bring their meager kills directly to her fire. The women trusted her judgment, watching without complaint as she divided the food, always ensuring the children and Naiche received a little more. She was the heart of their survival, and her skillet was its throne. The children, confined by the weather, became restless, to keep their minds from their empty bellies. Eve created a schoolroom in the snow. She would find a smooth, protected patch of white near the cook fire and, with a charred stick, draw the letters of her alphabet. S is for snow, she would say, her breath pluming in the frigid air, and a half-dozen small mittened hands would copy the curving shape with their own sticks. Ashki, ever her most serious student, would practice for hours, his brow furrowed in concentration, until his section of the snow was a mess of careful, melting letters. It was a small act of defiance against the overwhelming power of the winter, a declaration that even here, in the heart of the cold, the mind could still learn and grow. But a deeper cold, the cold of fear, seeped into the camp during Nantan's absences. He was gone more often now, scouting the territory, his eyes their only warning against the movements of Silas Creed or the patrols from the fort. Each time he left, a piece of the camp's spirit went with him. They felt his absence like a missing wall, a breach in their defenses against the hostile world. He had been gone for 4 days, the longest yet. A brutal storm had descended on the second day, a blizzard that had buried the canyon even deeper and erased all tracks. Chato grew more agitated with each passing hour, pacing the perimeter of the camp like a caged wolf. Nietzsche sat by the fire, her hands still, her gaze lost in the flames, a living statue of worry. Eve kept a pot of thin broth simmering at all times, a constant offering of warmth for his return. The act was a vigil, a quiet prayer spoken in the language of steam and salt. She found herself scanning the canyon entrance 100 times a day, her heart leaping at every shadow, every trick of the light. The fear of his not returning was a physical thing, a cold knot in her gut that was worse than any hunger. He came back on the 5th day, not with the silent grace of a hunter, but with the stumbling gait of a defeated man. The sentry's low call brought every head up. He appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a figure made of snow and ice, barely recognizable. He took 3 steps into the camp and then his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees, then pitched forward into the snow. A collective gasp went through the camp, then a rush of movement. Chato reached him first, rolling him over. Nantan's face was a mask of ice, his lips blue, his eyes half closed. His buckskin shirt was frozen solid, and a crust of ice matted his black hair. He was shivering so violently his whole body convulsed. Eve was there a second later, her mind clear and sharp in the midst of the panic. "Bring him to the fire," she commanded, her voice cutting through the frightened whispers. And blankets, all of them. They carried him, his body stiff and unresponsive, and laid him on a bed of pine boughs she had already prepared near the fire's warmth. His shivering was a terrible, rattling sound, the sound of a body consuming itself in a desperate attempt to create heat. Eve worked with a focused urgency that bordered on fury. She was not just fighting the cold, she was fighting death itself. With Chato's help, she cut away the frozen laces of his shirt and peeled the stiff, icy hide from his skin. His flesh was shockingly cold, mottled and pale. She took the warmest, thickest wool blanket and wrapped it tightly around him, then another on top of that. She knelt by his head, her own hands numb with the cold. His hair was a mass of frozen tangles, with small, sharp beads of ice clinging to the strands. Gently, methodically, she began to pick them out, her fingers working with a delicate precision. Each piece of ice felt like a shard of the winter she was trying to drive from his body. He was so still, so vulnerable. The formidable warrior, the silent hunter, was reduced to this, a shivering, helpless man. A profound and aching tenderness washed over her, a feeling so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. For the next hour, she did not leave his side. She sent others for more wood, keeping the fire roaring. She heated stones in the coals and had them wrapped in scraps of hide, tucking them inside the blankets around his body. Slowly, miraculously, the violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, steady tremor. The color began to seep back into his lips. He was alive. She rose and went to her cooking supplies. Her mind was already on the next step, internal warmth, energy. She took a small handful of her precious cornmeal and stirred it into a pot of boiling water, whisking it into a smooth, thick porridge. From her chest, she took a small, sealed clay jar. Inside was a dark, thick syrup, the sweet nectar of the roasted agave hearts. It was a rare treat, a treasure she had been saving. She stirred a generous spoonful into the porridge, and the simple meal was transformed into a potent medicine of sweetness and life. He was conscious now, his eyes open but unfocused. She knelt beside him again and held a small spoonful of the warm porridge to his lips. He did not seem to recognize it. She touched the spoon to his mouth, and a little of the warmth and sweetness entered. His eyes cleared for a moment. He swallowed. She fed him like a child, one slow, careful spoonful at a time. He did not speak. He did not have the strength, but with each swallow, she could almost feel the life returning to him. the warmth spreading from his core, pushing back the deadly cold. When the bowl was empty, he closed his eyes, and his breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of a healing sleep. The camp settled into a watchful quiet. The crisis had passed. Eve finally sat, her body trembling with the aftermath of the intense effort. She stayed by the fire, mending a tear in a pair of Ashki's moccasins with a bone needle, her hands needing a simple, repetitive task to quiet her racing heart. Hours passed. The moon rose, flooding the snow-covered canyon with a pale, ethereal light. One by one, the others sought the warmth of their wickiups, until the only sounds were the soft sigh of the wind and the crackle of the fire. She did not know how long she'd been sitting there when she felt it. A presence. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. She turned her head slightly. Nantan was standing behind her. He was wrapped in the thick wool blanket, his feet bare on the cold ground. He had moved with his accustomed silence, and she had not heard him rise. He just stood there, watching her in the firelight. His face was still pale and drawn, but the life was back in his eyes. They were dark and deep, and they held an expression she had never seen before. He moved, his step still a little unsteady, and came to stand directly behind the stool where she sat. She did not move, did not breathe. She could feel the heat of his body through the blanket, a living warmth that seemed to reach out and touch her. He rested his hands lightly on her shoulders, his touch a gentle weight. He stood like that for a long moment, simply looking down at her. Then, he lowered his head. She felt the warmth of his breath near her temple. He was so close she could smell the clean, cold scent of the night that still clung to him, mingled with the scent of wood smoke from the fire. He breathed in, and she knew he was taking in the scent of her hair, the simple smell of yucca soap and home. Then, his lips brushed against her hair, just above her ear. It was a kiss, but it was not a kiss of passion. It was something else entirely. It was as light as a moth's wing, as gentle as falling snow, a gesture of profound and reverent tenderness. His voice came, a low whisper that was meant for her alone. He spoke in her language, the words slow and deliberate, each one a carefully chosen stone dropped into the quiet pool of the night. "You are my spring." He said nothing more. He lifted his head. His hands fell away from her shoulders, and he turned and walked back to his sleeping place, disappearing into the shadows. Evelyn sat perfectly still, the world seeming to hold its breath around her. She could still feel the ghost of his lips on her hair, a tiny point of warmth in the vast, cold night. You are my spring, in the dead of winter, in a world of ice and hunger and death. He had looked at her and seen a promise of warmth, of life, of renewal. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. Her hand moved, as if with a will of its own, toward the place beside his sleeping roll where he had left his knife belt. Her fingers found the worn leather of the sheath, and then the cool, smooth disk of her mother's silver charm. She closed her hand around it, the metal a solid, real thing in her palm. She looked at the fire, at the sleeping forms of the people she now called her own, at the dark space where he lay. She spoke, her voice a fierce whisper aimed at the heart of the fire. "To bring you back to the spring, you have to live." It was not a reply to his words. It was a vow. It was the other half of his promise. It was the law of survival, now forged into a covenant of two hearts in the unforgiving cold. The fragile intimacy born in the firelight was as short-lived as a winter thaw. The quiet understanding that had passed between Nantan and Evelyn was a seed of warmth, but the ground around it was frozen hard, and the blizzards were not yet finished. The next blow came not from a direct assault, but from a whisper on the wind, a story carried back by a scout who had risked the lowlands for news. Silas Creed had struck again, this time. His target was not a freight wagon, but a small, struggling family of migrants, newcomers who had built a sod hut and a supply shed near a frozen creek. Creed's men had not touched the family. They had done something colder. They had burned the shed to the ground, destroying the family's entire store of winter food and seed for the spring planting. And in the snow, around the smoking ruins, they had left their signature of lies, the carefully faked print of Apache moccasins. The news spread through the territory like a fever. A story was spun in the saloons and general stores of Santo Lobo, a tale of heartless savages preying on innocent settlers. The bounty notices were re-inked, the reward doubled. The county patrol, a posse of grim-faced ranchers and deputized townsfolk, was officially called upon to pacify the region, a clean phrase for a dirty business. The pressure rolled downhill. The larger Chiricahua bands, led by a weary and pragmatic chief, were forced to make a bitter choice, to avoid a full-scale war. They agreed to pull back from their winter hunting grounds, to cede the very lands that were now being used as a pretext to hunt them. For the small, isolated band in the canyon, it was a death sentence. Their refuge was no longer a secret, and the land around it was now crawling with armed men who saw any Apache as a target for sport and profit. They had to move. The dismantling of the camp was a hurried, somber affair. Wickiups were stripped of their hides, belongings were bundled, and the small comforts of a settled place were packed away. It was an evacuation, a retreat into an even more uncertain future. In the haste, a young woman stumbled, dropping a large clay pot used for storing water. It did not shatter, but a long, jagged crack appeared, running from its lip to its base. It was a wound in the very vessel of their sustenance. The woman began to weep quietly, seeing it as a terrible omen. Eve picked up the two pieces. The pot was heavy, essential. She looked at the clean break, then she went to her own chest and took out a small metal file and a handful of rivets she had scrooged from a broken crate on the trail. While the others packed, she sat by the dying fire, patiently, carefully, drilling small holes along either side of the crack. She fitted the rivets, and with a hammerstone, painstakingly pinned them tight. Pulling the two sides of the wound together, it was a clumsy, ugly repair. A scar of metal on the smooth clay, but when she was finished, she filled it with water. And it held. The pot was scarred, but whole. That night, as they made a cold, temporary camp in a new and unfamiliar shelter, Eve felt the full weight of her decision. The world she had left behind was actively trying to kill the people she now lived with. She took out a stub of a pencil and a precious, folded sheet of paper from her mother's Bible. By the light of a tiny, shielded candle, she began to write a letter she knew would never be sent. "Dear Father," she wrote, the words stiff and unfamiliar, "I do not know if you are living or dead, but I find myself thinking of you tonight. You spent your life chasing something you could never quite catch. I think, for a time. So did I. I was just chasing survival. But I have found something else here. I have found people who are being buried under a mountain of lies. The world says they are monsters. But I have seen them be kind. I have seen them share the last of their food. I have seen them grieve. I have made my choice. I have chosen to stand with the accused. I do not know if this is the right path, but it is the one I must walk. Your daughter, Evelyn." She folded the paper and tucked it back into the Bible. As she snuffed out the candle, she looked at her hands. They were smudged with soot from the fire and the fine gray dust of the clay pot. The ashes felt like a permanent stain, the mark of her new allegiance. The journey was brutal. They moved through the high country, sticking to game trails and frozen ridge lines where the snow was windswept and shallow. The cold was a physical enemy, relentless and cruel, and it found a weakness in the strongest among them. It began with a cough, a dry, rattling sound from deep within Nietzsche's chest. At first, she dismissed it, but the cough worsened with every mile, and a fever began to burn behind her eyes. By the time they found a new, defensible canyon to make their winter camp, she was too weak to walk. They made her as comfortable as they could in the warmest wickiup, piling furs and blankets upon her. But the illness had taken root. It was pneumonia, a familiar killer in the damp. freezing cold of a hard winter. Eve brewed hot broths for her, steeped herbs that one of the women said would ease her breathing. She sat with her for hours, wiping her brow with a cool, damp cloth. But the fire in Nietzsche's lungs was consuming her. The entire camp fell under the shadow of her illness. The matriarch, the center of their world, was fading. Chato was a storm of helpless fury, his grief manifesting as a snarling anger at the world. But it was Nantan who worried Eve the most. He withdrew completely. The warmth she had seen in his eyes, the fragile promise of his whispered words, all of it vanished. He became a figure of cold, hard stone. He would sit for hours outside Nietzsche's wickiup, sharpening his knife with a slow, merciless rhythm, his face a mask of impenetrable grief. He spoke to no one. When Eve would bring him a bowl of soup, he would take it without a word, his eyes looking through her as if she were a ghost. The spring she was supposed to be for him had been buried under a fresh and terrible winter of his own heart. Nietzsche died in the dark hour before the dawn. Eve was with her. The old woman's breathing had become shallow, a faint whisper of air. Her eyes, which had been clouded with fever, suddenly cleared. She looked at Eve, her gaze lucid and sharp. Her hand, a small, frail thing like a bird's claw, reached out and gripped Eve's with surprising strength.
"Keep the fire,"
Nietzsche whispered, her voice a dry rasp.
"The fire is home."
Then she closed her eyes, and the last of her breath sighed out into the cold air. The grief that followed was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was a silent, personal sorrow. There was no wailing, only a profound and terrible stillness. Nantan took her body, wrapped in her finest blanket, and carried it high into the rocks, to a place where the sky could receive her spirit. When he returned, the coldness around him had solidified. He was no longer just grieving. He was a weapon being honed by his own pain. Chato exploded. His rage, held in check by Nietzsche's presence, now had no master. He strode into the center of the camp, his face contorted with a desire for vengeance. "This is the work of Creed," he spat, his voice shaking with fury. "Her death is on his hands. We will hunt him. We will find every one of his men, and we will make them pay in blood." He looked at Nantan, his eyes blazing with a direct challenge. "Are you a chief, or are you a stone? Will you lead us to vengeance, or will you sit here and sharpen your blade until it turns to dust?" Eve saw the men of the camp looking from Chato to Nantan, their own grief and anger making them receptive to Chato's call for blood. She stood between two fires, the consuming fire of Chato's rage, and the freezing internal fire of Nantan's grief. Both would lead to their destruction. Nantan finally looked up from his knife. His eyes were like chips of obsidian. He rose to his feet, his movements slow and deliberate. He was not a stone. He was a man pushed to the very edge of his endurance. "Blood will not bring her back," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Fighting them on their terms is a fool's game. We kill one of them, they send 10 soldiers. We kill 10, they send 100. They will not stop until we are all gone. That is what they want." "So we do nothing," Chato roared. "We let them kill us slowly, with the lies and disease." "No," Nantan said, and for the first time, a flicker of the old fire returned to his eyes. "We do not fight their war. We destroy their reason for it." He walked to the fire, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces of his people. "They hunt us because of a lie, that we are thieves and killers. So long as that lie exists, we will never be safe." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. A war fought with rifles cannot kill a lie, but the truth can. He looked directly at Eve, and in his gaze, she saw the cold grief give way to a grim, calculated purpose. "We do not need more dead men. We need a witness. One of Creed's men, a man who will talk, a man who will tell a judge, in a town, with everyone listening, who paid him, who hired Silas Creed to steal this land." The plan was audacious. It was nearly impossible. It was also their only hope. Chatto was silent, his rage momentarily silenced by the cold, hard logic of Nantan's strategy. Nantan's eyes stayed on Eve. He did not have to say the next words. She already knew them. She knew what he needed. He needed bait. He needed a lure so tempting, so irresistible, that Creed himself would not be able to ignore it. A lure that would bring them out into the open, where a witness could be taken. She thought of Nietzsche's last words. Keep the fire. The fire is home. Sometimes, keeping the fire meant shielding it from the wind, and sometimes it meant using it to burn away the darkness. She stepped forward, her heart a cold, steady beat in her chest. She had repaired the broken pot. She would help repair their broken world. They are already telling stories about me, she said, her voice clear and strong in the cold. Still air, the white cook who cooks for the Apache. Let us give them a new story to tell. She accepted the danger, not with fear, but with a weary and resolute calm. She would be their lure. She would be the fire they saw in the distance, the one that would draw the wolves out of the shadows and into the light. Santo Lobo was a town holding its breath. The winter fair, usually a time of boisterous release after the autumn roundup, was a strained affair. There was music from a fiddler whose tune sounded thin and brittle in the cold air, and the smell of cheap whiskey and roasting meat mingled with the ever-present tension. Men stood in tight, watchful groups, their hands never far from the guns at their hips. The bounty notices, with their stark, brutal promise of cash for human lives, were still nailed to the post outside the sheriff's office. A constant, ugly reminder of the fear that gripped the town. And at the center of this fear, playing the part of its antidote, was Silas Creed. He moved through the small crowd like a proprietor, a broad, confident man radiating a dangerous authority. He was not an official lawman, but he had assumed the role of the town's protector. He accepted pats on the back and free drinks from nervous merchants, his presence a guarantee that the savages in the hills would be kept at bay. He was a hero forged from a lie, and the town, desperate for a hero, had chosen not to look too closely at the fine print. Into this theater of fear rode Evelyn Hart. She came not as a warrior or a victim, but as what she had always been, a cook. She sat straight-backed on her mule, her gaze fixed ahead, betraying none of the frantic terror that fluttered in her chest. Her skillet was tied to one side of the mule, her spice chest to the other. She looked like any other itinerant worker, a woman down on her luck, hoping to earn a few dollars from the fair day crowd. No one gave her a second glance as she guided her mule to an open spot in the main square, a patch of hard-packed frozen earth directly across from the saloon where Creed was holding court. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried calm that was a lie. Inside, her entire being was screaming. This was a madness born of desperation. Nantan, Chatto, and two other warriors were somewhere in the crowd, unseen, having slipped into town separately, their faces carefully obscured, their weapons hidden. They were ghosts at the feast, waiting. Her job was to set the stage. Her job was to be the bait. She built her fire, the simple, familiar motions a balm to her frayed nerves. She filled her largest cast-iron pot with beans and water, the supplies Nantan's people had insisted she take, a small portion of their own dwindling stores. As the pot began to warm, she chopped onions and salt pork, the rhythmic thud of her knife a steadying beat. Soon, the humble, savory aroma of simmering pinto beans began to drift across the square. It was a smell of home, of warmth, of sustenance. It was a smell of peace, a stark contrast to the scent of fear and whiskey that hung in the air. People began to drift toward her fire. First the children, drawn by the promise of food, then a few families, then some curious cowhands. She started a batch of cornbread, the batter sizzling as it hit the hot, greased skillet. She worked in a focused silence, her face calm, her movements efficient. She was not selling food. She was casting a net woven of the most basic human need. She saw him long before he saw her. Silas Creed stepped out of the saloon, flanked by two of his men. He was laughing, a loud, booming sound that held no real humor. He surveyed the square, his pale eyes sweeping over the crowd, a king inspecting his domain. Then his gaze fell on her small, busy cook fire, and he stopped. His laughter died. He stared for a long moment, a flicker of disbelief, then recognition, hardening his face. He began to walk toward her, his men falling in step behind him. The crowd around her fire seemed to feel the change in the atmosphere. They shuffled back, creating a clear space around her, leaving her suddenly exposed, alone with her pot and her fire. Nantan's words echoed in her mind. Let him come to you. He will not be able to resist showing the town who is in charge. Creed stopped a few feet from her fire. He looked down at her, a smirk twisting his lips. Well, look what we have here, he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The little lost bird. I heard you taken up with the savages. Seems the stories were true. Eve did not look up. She continued to flip a piece of cornbread, her hand steady. I cook for whoever is hungry, she said, her voice even. Is that right? Creed sneered. Well, your friends ain't welcome here. This is a clean town. He was playing to the crowd, reinforcing his role as their protector. He was making her the outsider, the collaborator. At that moment, a man stumbled out from the edge of the crowd. He was thin, with a ragged coat and a haunted look in his eyes. He had been drawn by the smell of the beans. But as he got closer, he saw Creed, and he froze. His face went slack with a look of pure, animal terror. It was him, the henchman from Arroyo Seco, the one Nantan had spared. Creed saw the man at the same instant. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of cold fury. This was not part of his plan. A loose end, a witness. The henchman's terror gave way to a desperate, panicked anger. He pointed a trembling finger at Creed. It's you, he croaked, his voice raspy. They call you Creed here. But I know you. You're the captain. You're the one who led us at the Arroyo. A confused murmur went through the crowd. Creed took a step toward the man, his face a mask of murderous rage. You're drunk, he snarled. I've never seen you before in my life. You lie, the man shrieked, finding his voice. You led us. You told us to take the silver and blame the Apache. You paid us. The truth was out, raw and ugly, hanging in the cold winter air. For a moment, no one moved. The entire town square was frozen in a tableau of shock. Silas Creed was a man of action, not words. His mask of protector had shattered, revealing the killer beneath. His hand blurred as it dropped to the butt of his revolver. His intention was clear: to silence the witness, permanently. But from the crowd, another shadow blurred into motion. Nantan. He moved with a speed that was almost inhuman, a silent, deadly force. He was not trying to attack Creed. He was trying to save the witness. He shoved the ragged man hard, sending him stumbling backward, out of the line of fire. Creed's gun was already clearing the holster. The barrel swung up, a black circle of death. Nantan was now directly in its path. The world seemed to slow down. Eve saw the flash from the gun's muzzle, a bright, ugly flower of orange. She heard the deafening crack of the shot. She saw Nantan stagger back, a look of shock on his face, his hand flying to his hip. And then she saw a spark, a brilliant, impossible flash of silver from Nantan's belt, followed by the high, angry whine of a ricochet. The bullet, deflected by the small, hammered disc of her mother's charm, screamed off into the sky. The moment of stunned silence was broken by a roar of pure, primal rage from Silas Creed. But before he could aim for a second shot, Eve acted. Her fear, her grief, her love, her desperate will to survive, all of it coalesced into a single, explosive motion. She did not think. She became the fire. With a cry that was torn from the depths of her soul, she grabbed the heavy iron pot of boiling beans with both hands. It was a terrible, searing weight. She heaved it forward, not throwing the pot itself, but its contents. A scalding, steaming wave of brown beans and thick broth arced through the air. It struck Creed's right arm. The one holding the gun. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony that was shockingly unlike his usual booming voice. The burning liquid drenched his arm and chest. The pain was blinding, electric. His fingers spasmed open, and the heavy revolver fell from his grasp, clattering onto the frozen ground. Chaos erupted. The crowd surged, some people shouting in anger at the attack on their protector, others yelling in fear. Creed's men started to draw their own weapons. But before another shot could be fired, Chatto and the other warriors materialized from the crowd, not with rifles, but with knives held ready, their faces grim and determined, forming a protective circle around Eve and the now clutching Nantan. At that moment, the town's deputy sheriff pushed his way through the crowd. He was a young man with a hesitant, uncertain look in his eyes, a man clearly out of his depth. He saw Creed on the ground, clutching his scalded arm, his gun lying in the dirt. He saw the Apache warriors, poised and deadly. He saw the divided, angry crowd. He was paralyzed by indecision. Then, one of the other warriors stepped forward. He opened his palm. Lying in it was a single, small brass cartridge. He tossed it, and it landed in the snow at the deputy's feet. "Henry rifle," Nantan said, his voice tight with pain, but clear. "From the freight wagon massacre." The deputy stared at the casing. He was a lawman. He knew the reports. He knew that the evidence left at the scene, the evidence that had been used to condemn the Apache, was a .44. Henry's shell. He looked from the casing on the ground to the rifles held by Creed's men, who were now frozen with uncertainty. He saw 2 Henry repeating rifles among them. The pieces were no longer just whispers and rumors. They were hard facts, lying at his feet. The witness, the gun, the bullet casing, the rifles. The lie was unraveling. Right here in the center of his town. He made his choice, with a new and surprising firmness in his expression. He bent down and picked up Creed's fallen revolver. He walked over to the whimpering man and, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt, clamped one onto Creed's uninjured wrist. "Silas Creed," the deputy said, his voice shaking only slightly. "You are under arrest for robbery and murder." A stunned silence fell over the town square. Creed's men, their leader captured, their crimes exposed, looked at each other, and the fight went out of them. They slowly, reluctantly, raised their hands. The men of the county patrol, who had been moving in to support Creed, stopped in their tracks, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning comprehension. They lowered their rifles. The battle for Santo Lobo had been won, not with a volley of rifle fire, but with the courage of a witness, the deflection of a silver charm, and a pot of hot beans. The truth, scalding and undeniable, had finally been served. The retreat from Santo Lobo was not a victory parade. It was a quiet, sober withdrawal under the watchful, uncertain eyes of a town still reeling from the unmasking of its hero. The young deputy, his newfound authority sitting uneasily on his shoulders, ensured their passage was clear. He walked with them to the edge of town, a silent, official escort. His presence a shield against the simmering resentment of some and the dawning respect of others. The crowd parted for them, their faces a confusing mixture of suspicion, gratitude, and shame. The journey back to the hidden canyon was a long, silent procession of grief. The news of Creed's capture was a hard, cold stone of fact, but it offered little warmth against the fresh pain of Nietzsche's absence. She was the one who should have been leading them, her wisdom a steady light. Without her, the victory felt incomplete, the future a vast, uncharted territory. They did not bury her in the ground. Nantan, his face a mask of sorrow so profound it seemed to have been carved from the canyon rock itself, led them to a high ledge, a place open to the sky and the wind. They wrapped her body in her finest hides and laid her in a deep crevice, sealing it with a wall of carefully chosen stones. It was not a place of ending, but a place of watching, where her spirit could look out over the lands she had loved and protected. There were no grand speeches, no ceremonial wailing. Each person, in their own silence, paid their respects. Chato stood with his head bowed, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. Ashki, his small face streaked with tears he did not try to hide, placed a single, perfect eagle feather among the stones. Throughout the simple, solemn ritual, Evelyn cooked. It was the only way she knew how to speak the language of grief and respect. She built a fire, and with the last of their cornmeal, she made a large batch of flat, dense cornbread, a food of substance and survival. She took the bones from their last hunt and set them to simmer in her largest pot, coaxing a thin but nourishing soup from them, an offering of life made from the very framework of what was gone. When the small ceremony was over, they gathered around her fire, the shared warmth a bulwark against the cold and their sorrow. They ate the bread and drank the soup in near silence, the simple meal a communion of loss. Afterward, as the last of the light bled from the sky, Nantan came to her. He held something in his hand. It was a long, thick strand of Nietzsche's hair, dark as a raven's wing but shot through with threads of pure, brilliant silver. He had braided it tightly, and it felt strong and vital in his palm. He held it out to her. Eve looked at him, her eyes questioning. "She saw the strength in you," he said, his voice low and rough with unshed tears. "She said your fire was the fire of us all." He gently pressed the braided lock of hair into her hand. It was surprisingly heavy, and it seemed to hold a residual warmth. "This is a thread of that fire, so you will not forget her. So her spirit will stay with your hands as you cook." Eve closed her fingers around the braid. It was the most precious thing she had ever held. It was an inheritance, a passing of a torch, an acceptance into the very heart of his people, bestowed by the man who was now their leader. She had no words, so she simply nodded, her throat tight with an emotion too deep for language. The next few days were a time of quiet recalibration. The world had shifted on its axis, and they were all trying to find their footing. Chato, the fire of his blind rage now banked to a bed of coals, was the first to find a new path. He watched as Mateo and Hernan, the traders they had rescued from Arroyo Seco, prepared to continue their journey. They were heading back along the trade routes, their wagon now laden with the goods they had managed to salvage. Chato walked over to them, his posture stiff but his eyes clear. "This land is not safe," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Others like Creed are out there, men who feed on fear." Mateo, a kind man with worry etched into the lines of his face, nodded grimly. "We know, but people need supplies. We have to try." "You will not go alone," Chato stated. It was not a question. He looked back at his own people, at the faces of the women and children who depended on him. Then he looked back at the trail. "My fight is not just in these canyons. It is out there, on the roads. Keeping them safe is another way to fight the lies." He turned to Nantan. "I will go with them. I will be a guard for the trade road. I will see that good people pass safely." Nantan looked at his friend, his oldest companion, and saw the profound change in him. Chato was no longer a warrior seeking vengeance. He was becoming a protector, choosing to build bridges of safety rather than burn paths of retribution. Nantan gave a single, solemn nod of approval. "Go with honor, my brother," he said. A few days after Chato's departure, a visitor arrived at the camp. It was the young deputy from Santo Lobo. Riding alone, his presence, without a posse, was a testament to the new and fragile trust that had been forged. He brought news. Silas Creed and his men had been taken to the county seat. The witness, the ragged man from the arroyo, had given his testimony, faced with a hanging rope. Creed's men had talked, naming the land agent, a man of wealth and influence, who had paid them to create a private war. "The whole scheme is coming apart," the deputy said. "Accepting a cup of hot, weak coffee from Eve, the bounty notices will come down by the end of the week. Officially, the chief has been told his people may return to the winter grounds. The deputy looked around at the small, weary band. It is not enough, but it is a start. The news was a profound relief, a lifting of a sentence of death, but there was still so much to be done. The world had been broken, and it needed mending. The mending began with a journey. Nantan and Eve, along with a few others, traveled to the place where the migrant family's supply shed had been burned. There, they met Mateo and Hernan, who had returned with a wagon full of fresh lumber and supplies, purchased with the profits from their trade. Together, Apache, Mexican, and one white woman, they began to rebuild. The work was hard and honest. The sound of hammers echoed in the cold, clear air. They raised new walls, set a new roof. Eve, in her element, set up a cook fire and made a huge pot of stew, feeding the entire work crew. The children, Ashki and Little Sparrow, played with the migrant family's young son, their laughter a sound of pure, uncomplicated hope. In the evenings, Eve would bring out the charred plank of wood that had been salvaged from the fire, the one with her alphabet lessons burned into it. The three children would sit together, their heads bent, tracing the letters with their fingers, their small voices sounding out the English words, a tiny, hopeful chorus against the vast silence of the plains. The days grew longer. The sun felt warmer on their faces. High on the south-facing slopes, the snow began to recede, and the first dark, wet patches of earth appeared. One afternoon, back in their own canyon, Eve watched as the first trickle of snowmelt began to snake its way down the rocky walls, a silver thread of life returning to the dry bed of the arroyo. The sound of dripping water was the first note in the symphony of the coming spring. She found Nantan sitting outside his wickiup, a block of dark, dense mesquite wood in his lap, his knife, which had been damaged in the fight. The handle cracked when he fell, lay beside him. He was carving a new handle, the long, sure strokes of his blade peeling away curls of the fragrant wood. He worked with the same patient, focused intensity he brought to everything, his hands shaping the wood not just into a tool, but into a thing of beauty. She sat near him, not speaking, simply watching his hands work. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space filled with all the things that no longer needed to be said. He finished shaping the handle, sanding it smooth with a piece of rough sandstone until it fit his hand perfectly. Then, he took the fine tip of his knife and began to carve into the dark, smooth surface of the mesquite. He was not carving his name or a warrior's symbol. With delicate, precise lines, he etched the shape of a flower, a stalk with a proud, high bloom of bell-shaped blossoms. Eve recognized it immediately. It was the yucca, the plant that had given them soap and food, the stubborn, resilient flower of the desert that always bloomed, no matter how harsh the winter had been. He was not just fixing his knife. He was marking a new beginning. He was taking the symbol of their survival and making it a permanent part of himself. He was giving a name to the peace they had fought so hard to win. He was naming the spring. The spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a slow, powerful force of will. It came first as a sound, the steady, rhythmic dripping of water from the high rock ledges, a sound that had been absent for months. Then it came as a scent, the rich, dark smell of thawing earth, a perfume of life returning. Patches of snow melted away to reveal the first pale, determined shoots of green. The air itself felt different, softer, carrying on its breath the promise of warmth and renewal. This rebirth of the world stood in stark contrast to the quiet turmoil in Evelyn's heart. The danger from Silas Creed was gone. The bounty notices were a thing of the past, but a new, more subtle threat had taken their place, the question of her future. As the trails became passable and the world opened up again, she found herself standing at a crossroads she had never anticipated. She was no longer just Evelyn Hart, the itinerant cook. In the eyes of the world, she had a new name, a new identity forged in smoke and conflict. To the Apache, she was the woman who had kept the fire, a respected ally who had earned her place among them. But to the white world, to the towns and the ranches and the forts, what was she? A curiosity. A traitor, a woman of loose morals who had gone native. The thought was a constant, low-grade fever in her mind. She could stay here, in the safety and belonging she had found in this small canyon. Or she could leave. She could make her way to a new territory, a place where no one had ever heard of Silas Creed or the white cook of Arroyo Seco. She could try to reclaim the simple, anonymous life she had once known, to wash the stain of her reputation clean. She wrestled with the choice for days, the question a constant companion as she went about her tasks. The joy of the returning spring was tainted by the uncertainty of her place in it. Finally, one evening, as she sat with Nantan watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight, she gave voice to her conflict. "The trails are open now," she began, her voice quiet. "A person could travel a long way." Nantan did not look at her. He continued to watch the sky, his face calm and unreadable. He knew this was not a simple observation about the weather. He had felt her restlessness, her quiet withdrawal into her own thoughts. He waited. "In Santo Lobo," she continued, struggling to find the right words, "they will tell a story about me, the people you saved, Mateo and Hernan. They will tell one story, but others will tell a different one." She looked down at her hands, at the calluses and scars that were a map of her winter. "I do not know what my name is anymore." Nantan was silent for a long time, so long that she thought he had not understood. The only sound was the gentle whisper of the evening breeze through the new leaves of the cottonwood trees. When he finally spoke, his voice was as calm and steady as the earth beneath them. "You came to us because you were lost," he said. "You stayed and cooked for us, and you fought beside us. You did this for life, not for war." He turned his head and looked at her then, his gaze direct and clear, holding no judgment, no expectation. "To stay or to go, that is your choice. Evelyn Hart, no one else's. Your life is your own to make." His words were a gift. He was not trying to hold her, to bind her with guilt or obligation. He was giving her back the one thing she thought she had lost herself, in his quiet respect for her freedom. He showed her the true depth of his feelings. He wanted her to stay, but only if it was a choice she made with a free and whole heart. In that moment, everything became clear. To leave would not be a cleansing, but a surrender. It would be an admission that the lies of others had the power to define her. To run away from the name they had given her was to let them win. Her mother had taught her to face down a challenge, not to turn her back on it. She would not run, but she would not simply be absorbed into the life of the canyon, either. She would build something new, a place that was entirely her own, a place that stood between the two worlds that were trying to claim her. "I will stay," she said, her voice filled with a new and certain strength. "But not here, not in the hidden places." She looked at him, her eyes shining with the clarity of her idea. "I will open a kitchen, on the main trail, where the Pelencillo Range comes down to the flats. A public place. I will cook for everyone. For the vaqueros driving their herds, for the men who cut timber in the hills, for the migrant families looking for a new start." She took a breath. "And for your people, when they come down from the mountains to trade, I will have a sign, with a list of what I serve, and the price for each, a fair price for all." It was a brilliant, radical plan. A public kitchen, run by a woman alone on the trail, would be a landmark, a known and fixed point in a transient world. A place with a public price list was a place of business, of law and order. It could not be easily dismissed as a renegade camp. She would not be taking a side. She would be creating a center, a place of neutrality and sustenance. She would use the very skill that had defined her in this conflict, her cooking, to build a new kind of peace. Nantan listened, and a slow, deep smile spread across his face. It was a rare and beautiful thing, a sight that transformed his stern, warrior's features into something warm and open. He saw the wisdom in her plan, the courage and the sheer, stubborn intelligence of it. She was not just accepting her fate, She was rewriting it. The next weeks were filled with the hard, satisfying labor of creation. Nantan helped her choose the spot, a place where a small, year-round spring trickled out from the rocks, shaded by a stand of ancient cottonwood trees. Together, they built her new home. It was not a wickiup. It was a simple, sturdy structure, half stone and half timber, with a wide, covered porch and a large, open-air cooking hearth protected by a roof of peeled logs. It was a kitchen with a house attached, a place built for work and welcome. Her first customers were wary, a pair of prospectors. Their eyes narrowed with suspicion, bought a cup of coffee and drank it standing up, their hands on their rifles. But the coffee was hot and strong, and the cornbread she gave them was fresh and warm. They left without a word. But the next day, a family in a rickety wagon stopped, having heard from the prospectors about the clean camp and the good food. Slowly, the whispers began to change. The story of the Apache cook was replaced by a new one. The story of the woman at Cottonwood Springs. Her kitchen became a stopping point, a place to rest and get a square meal on the long, hard road. She served everyone. Her prices were fair, and her pinto beans were the best in the territory. One evening, after a long day of serving a crew of railroad surveyors, she and Nantan sat together on the porch of her new home. The air was soft and warm, and the first yucca flowers were beginning to open, their creamy white blossoms glowing like lanterns in the twilight. He was cleaning his knife, the one with the new mesquite handle. He ran his thumb over the smooth, dark wood, over the delicate flower he had carved into it. He held it out for her to see in the fading light. Then, he unlaced the sinew that held her mother's silver charm to the sheath. He pressed the charm into her palm. "You do not need this to show me the way home anymore," he said, his voice a low murmur. "This is home." She closed her fingers around the familiar, cool metal. It had come full circle. It was no longer a prayer for his return from a dangerous world. It was a symbol of the safe harbor they had built together. She slipped the leather thong over her head, and the charm came to rest in the hollow of her throat, a part of her once more. He slid his knife back into its sheath. The carved yucca flower, the symbol of their spring, lay against his hip. It was his promise, his mark of the new season in his own heart. He stood up and moved to stand behind her as she sat on the porch steps. She felt the gentle weight of his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of his presence a familiar comfort. He lowered his head, and she tilted hers back slightly, her heart calm and full. His lips brushed against her hair, the same impossibly gentle touch, as light as a breath. This time, it was not a desperate whisper in the heart of a blizzard. It was a quiet affirmation in the warmth of a blooming spring, a kiss that spoke of partnership, of shared labor, and of a love that had grown, like the yucca, strong and resilient in the hardest of ground. They did not need grand declarations. They had their work, their shared meals, and the quiet, steady rhythm of their life together. They would simply watch each other grow. When the hot summer winds began to blow down from the Pelanchillo Mountains, they would light the cook fire. This time, it was not a fire to hide them from the world, but one to call the world in, to invite any weary traveler to a place where they could eat their fill and hear the truth. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Old West. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.